The rain hammered the harbor bridge without mercy on the night Cairo found the creature. It came down in cold, relentless sheets, the kind of rain that didn't care who it fell on or what it ruined. It soaked through cardboard and coats and good intentions with equal efficiency. The river below the bridge churned dark and loud, swallowing the sound of the city above it. The streetlights on either end of the bridge burned orange and distant, like eyes that had decided to look somewhere else. Cairo was 11 years old. He was small for his age, with knuckles that were always a little raw and eyes that were always a little older than the rest of his face. His boots were 2 sizes too large, stuffed at the toes with newspaper that had long since gone soft and useless. His jacket had a broken zipper he held closed with his fist, and in his other arm, pressed against his chest like something sacred, was the only blanket he owned, thin, fraying at the corners, smelling of cedar and a life that had belonged to someone else before it belonged to him. He had found his spot beneath the bridge's concrete arch where the worst of the rain couldn't reach. His cardboard was laid out. His backpack, 3 granola bars, a broken compass, a photograph, sat tucked close behind him. He was just pulling the blanket over his shoulders when he heard it. A sound near the river. Small, sharp, and full of pain. Cairo went very still and listened. Wedged between 2 broken cinder blocks was something that made no logical sense. Cairo stood over it for a full 3 seconds without moving, the rain hitting the back of his neck, his brain doing the slow and stubborn work of processing what his eyes were already certain about. He had seen plenty of things living on the streets, things that surprised him, things that scared him, things that broke his heart a little more each time. But nothing had ever prepared him for this. It was roughly the size of a large house cat, maybe a little smaller. Its body was compact and trembling, curled in on itself the way small creatures do when they're trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. And it was covered, every inch of it, in scales. Deep indigo scales that caught the distant orange glow of the streetlight and threw it back in fragments, like a handful of dark gemstones scattered across moving water. Its wings were folded tight against its body, translucent and veined, delicate as the inside of a moth's wing, but somehow structured, purposeful, the kind of thing that was built to do something extraordinary when it was not currently busy shaking itself apart in the cold. Then it opened its eyes, molten copper, burning and ancient and heartbreakingly small all at once. It looked directly up at Cairo with those impossible eyes, and it whimpered, a sound so thin and sharp it cut straight through the noise of the rain. Then it trembled violently and waited to see what the boy would do. Cairo stood in the rain for a long moment, looking at the creature in his hands. He hadn't planned to pick it up. It had simply happened the way certain things happen when you stop thinking and start feeling. His hands had moved before his brain had finished its argument about whether this was wise. And now it was there, nestled in his cupped palms, impossibly light, its indigo scales slick with rain, its whole body vibrating with a cold that seemed to go deeper than just the weather. He could feel its heartbeat against his fingers. It was very fast, too fast. The smart thing probably would have been to set it back down. He had nothing to offer. He was 11 years old and homeless and already operating on the thinnest possible margin between having enough and having nothing. He had 1 blanket, 3 granola bars, and a backpack that held everything he owned in the world. Taking on something else, something this fragile, this strange, this completely outside the boundaries of anything he understood, made no practical sense at all. Cairo had learned early, though, that the smart thing and the right thing did not always share an address. Without overthinking it any further, he turned and carried the creature back to his shelter beneath the bridge. He sat down on his cardboard, settled the small dragon carefully against his chest, and reached for his blanket. He shook it open slowly, making sure it was wide enough. Then he wrapped it around both of them, tucked the edges in against the cold, and held on. He broke his last granola bar into small pieces and offered them one at a time from his open palm. It was the last one. He knew that. He had known it when he reached into his backpack and felt the other 2 slots empty, had known it when his fingers closed around the familiar crinkle of the wrapper. He had been saving it for morning, for that specific hollow ache that came with waking up cold and needing something, anything to remind his body that the day was worth starting. But the creature was shaking, and Cairo understood hunger in a way that went beyond thought. It lived in him like a second language, fluent and constant. And something about the way the dragon curled in his lap, small and exhausted and entirely at his mercy, made the decision feel like no decision at all. He broke the bar into pieces as small as he could manage with numb fingers. Then he held out the first piece on his flat, open palm and waited. The dragon lifted its head slowly. It looked at the food. It looked at his face. Then it leaned forward and took the piece with a care that was almost formal. Lips pulled back just enough, teeth barely grazing his skin, as though it understood the value of what was being offered and refused to be careless with it. He fed it every piece that way, one at a time, until his palm was empty. When the last piece was gone, the dragon lowered its head back against his arm and exhaled. A breath so faint it was barely there at all. But it was warm, a thin, trembling thread of warmth that pressed into his skin like a small promise, like an ember that had nearly gone out completely and was only now beginning to remember what it used to be. Cairo closed his fingers gently around it and said nothing. Some things didn't need words. They slept through the storm together, a homeless boy and a lost dragon, each slightly less alone. The rain didn't stop. It hammered the concrete above them and rushed loud along the riverbank and filled the night with a sound like the world clearing its throat. But beneath the bridge, in the small pocket of warmth they had made between them, Cairo slept in a way he rarely managed. Deeply, without the usual half-alertness, he kept running even in sleep, that low and tireless watch his body had learned to keep out of pure necessity. The dragon slept too, its breathing slow and steady against his ribs, its warmth a quiet and constant thing, like a candle burning in a room just down the hall. For a few hours, the cold had no argument it could win. In the morning, pale gray light came in sideways under the bridge, and Cairo opened his eyes to the sound of the river, calmer now, the storm having moved on some time before dawn. The blanket was still around his shoulders. His backpack was still behind him. Everything was exactly where he had left it, except the dragon was gone. He sat with that for a moment, blinking at the empty space beside him where the warmth had been. The cardboard was still faintly pressed down in the shape of something small and curled. He reached out and touched it without thinking, then pulled his hand back. He told himself it didn't matter. Things left. People left. Warmth left. He had learned that lesson so many times and in so many ways that by now it should have felt like nothing at all. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and told himself it didn't matter. He almost believed it. They slept through the storm together, a homeless boy and a lost dragon, each slightly less alone. The rain didn't stop. It hammered the concrete above them and rushed loud along the riverbank and filled the night with a sound like the world clearing its throat. But beneath the bridge, in the small pocket of warmth they had made between them, Cairo slept in a way he rarely managed. Deeply, without the usual half-alertness, he kept running even in sleep, that low and tireless watch his body had learned to keep out of pure necessity. The dragon slept too, its breathing slow and steady against his ribs, its warmth a quiet and constant thing, like a candle burning in a room just down the hall. For a few hours, the cold had no argument it could win. In the morning, pale gray light came in sideways under the bridge, and Cairo opened his eyes to the sound of the river, calmer now, the storm having moved on some time before dawn. The blanket was still around his shoulders. His backpack was still behind him. Everything was exactly where he had left it, except the dragon was gone. He sat with that for a moment, blinking at the empty space beside him where the warmth had been. The cardboard was still faintly pressed down in the shape of something small and curled. He reached out and touched it without thinking, then pulled his hand back. He told himself it didn't matter. Things left. People left. Warmth left. He had learned that lesson so many times and in so many ways that by now it should have felt like nothing at all. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and told himself it didn't matter. He almost believed it. 7 years passed in shelters and sidewalks, in hunger and hard lessons and slow, painful rebuilding. They did not pass kindly or quickly. They passed the way hard years do, in fragments, in setbacks, in small victories that felt enormous, because everything had to be built from nothing and nothing was ever given freely. There were shelter beds and curfews and the particular indignity of being young and poor and invisible to most of the world moving around you. There were cold mornings and missed meals and nights when the math of surviving simply did not add up no matter how many times he ran it. But Cairo ran anyway. Every time. He grew into himself slowly, lean and careful, with a quietness about him that was not shyness but something more deliberate. He had learned to read rooms before entering them, to measure people quickly and accurately, to spend his energy only where it had a reasonable chance of matching. The streets had given him that at least, a certain precise and unsentimental understanding of how the world actually worked. He was 17 when he first walked into Marta's diner on the east side, looking for anything at all. He was 18 when Marta herself, broad-shouldered, gray-streaked, with a voice like gravel and a tin can and a talent for recognizing useful people, handed him an apron and pointed him toward the sink. He washed dishes for 2 years without complaint and showed up early every single shift. Eventually Marta noticed. But the habit that stayed with him through all of it, through every transition and difficulty and new beginning, was one he could never fully explain to anyone who asked. Each night, before he went inside, wherever inside happened to be, he left something outside. Food, mostly. Whatever he could spare, and sometimes a little more than that. He told himself it was just something he did. He never examined it any closer than that. On a cold Tuesday morning, when Cairo was 22, he found a package on his doorstep with no address and no postage. He almost stepped over it. He was running 4 minutes behind, jacket half-zipped, coffee cooling in his hand, mind already at the diner, running through the morning prep list. It was the weight of it that stopped him, or rather the absence of weight, the way it sat on the step with a stillness that seemed slightly too deliberate for something that had simply been delivered. He crouched down and picked it up. It was wrapped in something that was not quite paper. Darker than paper, tougher, with a faint iridescence that shifted between deep indigo and black, depending on how the pale October light caught it. There was no label, no stump, no name written anywhere on its surface. Just the wrapping, folded with a precision that felt somehow ancient, the edges creased in ways that did not match any folding technique his hands recognized. He stood there on his doorstep in the cold morning air and turned it over twice. Then he went back inside, set his coffee down, and opened it carefully at the kitchen table. Inside, nestled in a layer of the same dark material, was a stone, smooth and perfectly oval, small enough to close his fingers around completely. It was deep blue, the specific deep blue of the sky in a last moment before it commits fully to night. Every surface of it was polished to a quiet, absolute perfection. He picked it up. It was warm, not room temperature warm, not the residual warmth of something recently handled. Genuinely, steadily warm, the way a living thing is warm, from the inside out, as though it had its own quiet heat source that the October air had no say over whatsoever. Carved into one face of the stone was a single symbol, a spiral that moved outward from its center with a fluid, unhurried confidence. But the longer he looked at it, the more it resolved into something else, a wing caught mid-motion. 2 weeks later, walking past the Harbor Bridge, Cairo heard something moving through the air above him. He still walked this route sometimes. He had never fully decided why. The east side had plenty of streets that connected his apartment above the laundromat to Marta's diner without bringing him anywhere near the river or the old bridge. He took this one anyway. Most evenings, in the particular unexamined way that people return to certain places without requiring a reason from themselves. It was a Thursday night, late, the city quiet in that specific way it gets after 10, when the last of the dinner crowds have thinned out and the streets belong mostly to people with somewhere to be and people with nowhere to go. His hands were in his jacket pockets. The stone was there too, as it had been every day since he found it, warm against his fingers without fail. He heard it before he saw it. Not wind, not a bird. Something deliberate moving through the air with a rhythm that was entirely wrong for anything he had a name for, deep and measured, each beat carrying real weight, the sound of it displacing the air around him in slow, rolling waves he felt in his chest before he consciously registered them as sound. He stopped walking. He looked up. It came down out of the dark sky with a controlled and unhurried precision, wings angling back as it descended, and it landed in the empty street before him with a solidity that sent a faint tremor through the pavement beneath his feet. The dragon that stood before him was no longer small. It stood at the height of a draft horse, its body dense and powerful, and carrying the particular stillness of something that has learned through long years to be careful about how much space it takes up around fragile things. Its scales were the same deep indigo he remembered from a riverbank 11 years ago, but richer now, layered with age and depth, shot through with veins of silver that caught the streetlight and held it. Cairo reached out slowly and placed his hand flat against the side of its enormous jaw. He didn't plan it. His arm simply rose, the way it had risen 11 years ago beside a river when his hands had moved before his brain had finished its argument. The motion came from the same place, somewhere beneath logic, beneath caution, beneath every careful wall he had spent years constructing around the parts of himself that were still capable of being hurt by things leaving. His palm met scales that were warm and smooth and harder than anything he had ever touched, each one individually articulated, shifting almost imperceptibly beneath his hand like the surface of something breathing. And it was breathing. He could feel it, slow and deep and vast, the breath of something that measured time in centuries rather than years. The dragon went absolutely still the moment he touched it, not the stillness of an animal bracing. The stillness of something receiving something it has waited a very long time for. Every muscle, every scale, every inch of that enormous and powerful body simply settled. The way a held breath finally releases. The way a question finally gets its answer. Then it closed its eyes. The exhale that followed rolled over Cairo in a slow, warm wave that smelled of deep stone and high wind, and something electric and ancient that had no name in any language he spoke. It pressed against his face like a hand, like a memory, like 11 years compressed into a single breath and offered back to him all at once. He stood in the empty street beneath the Harbor Bridge with his palm against the jaw of a dragon the size of a draft horse and felt something in his chest quietly come unaudit. He said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "Hey." His voice came out lower than he intended, rough at the edges. "You got big." The dragon's copper eyes stayed closed. But at the corner of its jaw, beneath his hand, something shifted, a slow and unmise. Her name translated loosely to she who returns to the warmth, but Cairo simply called her Vare. He had gotten the translation from a scholar at the university on the north side of the city, a small, precise woman named Dr. Ellison who studied ancient draconic linguistics and who, when Cairo described the sound as best he could reproduce it, had gone very still in her chair and asked him twice to repeat it. She had written the transliteration in a careful hand on a yellow notepad, underlined it once, and then looked up at him over her glasses with an expression caught somewhere between professional composure and complete personal astonishment. He had thanked her, folded the paper into his jacket pocket, and walked home with the warm stone turning slowly in his fingers. She who returns to the warmth. He turned that over in his mind for several days, the way he turned the stone, quietly without forcing it, letting it mean what it meant in its own time. Then he set the full name gently aside and kept only the part that fit in a single breath. Vorda. She came and went with the rhythm of seasons, appearing without announcement and disappearing the same way, ranging out across territories that existed in no atlas he had ever opened. She went to places where mountains had no names and rivers had never been followed to their source, where the sky was wide enough to matter and the world still had edges that hadn't been mapped or measured or claimed. She was gone sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, once for almost an entire year, during which Cairo told himself with reasonable success that he was fine and that the absence of something was not the same as the loss of it. But she always came back, and she never arrived without leaving something behind. On his windowsill, on his doorstep, tucked into the alley out back with the patience of something that had made a private and permanent decision about where it belonged and to whom. He stopped by. Gemstones appeared on his windowsill. Not always. Not on any schedule he could track or predict. But regularly enough that he had stopped startling at them, stopped picking them up with that first disbelieving turning over in his hands, that checking and rechecking of what his eyes were telling him. Now he simply found them in the morning when he opened the curtains, sitting on the sill with the casual certainty of things that had always belonged exactly where they were. They were never flashy, never the exaggerated, theatrical gems of old stories, no fist-sized rubies, no diamonds catching the light from across the room. They were quieter than that. Deep blues and forest greens and occasional warm ambers, smooth and dense, each one carrying that same interior warmth as the first stone, as though they had all been kept somewhere that cold had never learned to reach. He had no idea what to do with them for the first several months. Then one evening he sat down with a pad of paper and did what he had always done with the few resources he had ever managed to hold on to. He thought carefully about where they could do the most good, and he made a plan. The ancient gold coins helped most with that. They came in a carved wooden box left outside his door on a Wednesday morning. 5 coins, so old the kingdoms stamped on their faces had been dust for 8 centuries. He took them to a dealer on the west side who asked no unnecessary questions and offered a fair price without flinching. That money fixed the persistent leak in his roof. It repaid a loan from Marta that she had long since stopped counting and never once mentioned. And the remainder went quietly into 2 shelters on the east side of the city, donated without his name attached, because Cairo had learned early that generosity did not require an audience. But of everything Vare left behind, the night of the fever was the one he returned to most. He had been genuinely sick, the deep, disorienting. She could not speak in words, but she listened the way almost no one ever did, completely, without rushing, without looking away. Cairo had not realized how rare that was until he experienced it fully. He had talked to people his whole life, caseworkers and shelter staff and co-workers and Marta, who was as good a listener as most, but there was always something else running beneath the surface of those conversations. An agenda, however kind, a clock, however patient, a small and human restlessness that no amount of goodwill could entirely eliminate. Vare had none of that. When he talked, she was simply there, copper eyes steady and open, body still, the whole enormous weight of her attention resting on him without pressure, the way good light rests on things, illuminating without demanding. She did not shift or glance away or offer solutions before he had finished. She did not flinch at the difficult parts or rush him past the ones that needed room to breathe. She just listened, completely, as though every word he said was worth the full cost of her attention, and she was wealthy enough in that particular currency to spend it without calculation. He told her about his mother on a quiet evening in late September, sitting in the alley behind the diner after closing, the city winding itself down around them. He had not planned to. It came out the way things come out when you are finally, genuinely heard, slowly at first, then all at once, the words finding their own order without him having to arrange them. He told her about the photograph in the backpack, about the way his mother had laughed, which he could still hear perfectly if he was very still and let himself, about the years after, the years of things going wrong, and then wronger, the long and exhausting work of becoming someone functional out of the raw material of someone broken. Vare did not move through any of it. When he finally went quiet, she lowered her head slowly until her 4. When Cairo was 43, sitting beneath the old bridge again, he finally asked her why she had truly come back. It had taken him that long to ask it, not because he hadn't wondered. He had wondered since the night she landed in the street before him, since the warm stone on the doorstep, since the morning he woke beneath this same bridge to find her gone and told himself it didn't matter. The question had lived in him quietly for decades, patient and undemanding, waiting for the moment he was ready to hear whatever the answer turned out to be. That evening felt like the moment. They had come here the way they sometimes did, without planning it, the route simply resolving itself beneath his feet the way it always had. The river was calmer than he ever remembered it being on that first night, moving dark and easy beneath the arch, catching the last of the evening light in long, slow ribbons. The city hummed its familiar distance behind them. The cardboard and the broken cinder blocks were long gone, replaced by nothing in particular, just concrete and shadow and the smell of water and time. Cairo sat with his back against the old stone pillar, and Vare lay beside him, her body curled with that careful deliberateness she always used in spaces built for human scale. Her warmth reached him steadily. Her breathing was slow and deep and even. He looked at the river for a while before he spoke. "Why did you come back?" His voice came out quieter than he intended, stripped of everything except the actual question. "All those years ago, all those times after, you could have gone anywhere, found anywhere. Why here? Why me?" Vare was still for a long moment after he finished. Then she turned her head and looked at him with those copper eyes, unchanged across 32 years, burning with the same molten certainty that had looked up at him from a pair of cupped hands on a riverbank when he was 11 and had nothing and gave anyway. She held his gaze for. He understood it without needing translation. It arrived in him the way the truest things always arrive, not through the front door of conscious thought, but through something older and quieter, something that lived beneath language and had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be recognized. He didn't reach for it or reason toward it. It was simply there, complete and certain, the way the stone had been warm in his hand that first October morning before he had any framework for understanding why. He had been 11 years old, and he had had nothing. Not almost nothing. Not the comfortable, dramatic nothing of stories where nothing turns out to mean something hidden nearby. Actual nothing. One blanket, 3 granola bars, a broken compass, a photograph, boots stuffed with wet newspaper, a jacket held shut with a fist. The arithmetic of his life at that age had been brutal in its simplicity. Every subtraction mattered. Every division left less. And yet, he had picked her up without negotiating the terms. He had carried her back without calculating the cost. He had moved over inside his one thin blanket and made room without asking whether she deserved the room or whether the room could be afforded or whether anything would ever come of the offering. He had broken his last granola bar into pieces and held them out one at a time on an open palm because she was hungry and he understood hunger, and that had been enough of a reason. He had not done it for return. He had not done it for safety or strategy or any of the careful transactional instincts the streets had otherwise burned into him. He had done it because 2 was better than 1, and his mother had told him that, and he had believed her, and belief was the one thing the years had never fully managed to take from him. Kindness remembered is not a debt. He understood that now, with a completeness that settled something in him he hadn't known was still unsettled. It was not a debt, not an O.